A nonverbal autistic boy hadn't spoken a word in 3 years until the day a black housekeeper walked into his life. But just as his heart began to open, a media storm hit, and she was forced to leave. The boy screamed her name in despair. And now, the billionaire father must decide. Will he risk everything to keep the one woman who made his son smile? Watch until the end for a heartwarming twist. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you love stories that truly touch the heart. Ethan Whitmore's mansion sat quietly beneath a canopy of rustling maple trees, as if trying to hide something. Maybe loneliness, maybe a void no one could ever fill. To the world, he was the golden mind of the tech industry, the youngest self-made billionaire to build an empire from scratch. But behind the iron gates, beyond the crystal chandeliers and multi-million-dollar art, Ethan was just a man who'd lost his way, a father who didn't know how to reach his own child. Miles, his 7-year-old son, was all that remained of his wife after a car accident 3 years ago. Since that day, Ethan buried himself in work, as if building another tower or acquiring another company could somehow patch the holes in his heart. But no billion-dollar deal ever made his only son look up at him, not even once. Miles didn't speak. He didn't smile. He didn't react when Ethan sat beside him reading bedtime stories or when the house staff offered him warm milk. He clutched a worn-out stuffed dinosaur, stared into space, and always wore noise-canceling headphones. His room was eerily tidy, not because he arranged it, but because he never played. Ethan had taken him everywhere: neurologists, child psychologists, the top multi-sensory preschools in New York. They all said the same thing. Miles was moderately on the autism spectrum. What he needed most was a stable environment, genuine affection, and above all, unconditional patience. But Ethan didn't have that. Or rather, he didn't know how to show it. Every time his son cried for reasons no one could explain, Ethan could only stand there, fists clenched, heart aching with helplessness. He once shouted at a doctor, "I can run a global empire, but I can't get my own son to fall asleep. What's wrong with me?" No one had an answer. Every night, after endless meetings, Ethan would quietly enter his son's room and sit beside the small bed like a shadow. He had once been a romantic husband, a hopeful father, but now all he had left was silence, the same silence that lived in his son. Then, on an early autumn day as the leaves began to turn, a young woman stepped into the house. Just a temporary hire, a housekeeper. No one could have predicted that her arrival would stir something in both frozen hearts, something that neither had felt in a very, very long time. Naomi Carter woke up at 5 a.m., like she did every day, in a one-bedroom rental tucked inside an aging Brooklyn walk-up. The ceiling leaked when it rained, and the outlet sparked every time she plugged in her hairdryer. But Naomi didn't complain. She was only 24, still young, but had been carrying the weight of the world since she was 16, when her mother died of cancer, and her father disappeared like he'd never existed. Since then, Naomi had been both mom and dad to her younger brother Jonah, a boy with severe autism who required near-constant care. She used to be a developmental psychology major, sophomore year, with an almost perfect GPA. But when her scholarship was cut and Jonah's medical bills piled up, Naomi had no choice but to drop out and start working full-time. She'd waited tables at a coffee shop, scrubbed floors for a law firm, and more recently picked up part-time cleaning gigs through a high-end domestic staffing agency. That morning, Naomi got a call from the agency at exactly 6:45 a.m. Urgent. VIP client needs a fill-in 1 to 2 weeks. Estate in Riverdale. Clean the main floor, keep things confidential, don't ask questions. Any kids? Naomi asked. Yeah, one boy, 7 years old, mom's passed. Be careful around the furniture. Naomi hesitated for a second. Children were never simple in a house that felt this cold, but she accepted the job. A shift like that could cover Jonah's medication for the week. The first time she stepped into the Whitmore estate, Naomi was struck by how sterile it felt, like a museum. Dark wood, cold marble, no laughter, no trace of childhood, except for a single plush dinosaur slumped sideways on the sofa. The housekeeper led her through the rooms, explaining things in a flat, almost robotic tone. Don't speak to the boy unless spoken to. The master doesn't like outsiders interfering, and under no circumstance should you enter the office on the second floor. Naomi nodded. She was used to unspoken rules, But it wasn't the man of the house that felt off. It was the way everyone walked, with quiet tension, like they were living beside a ticking bomb. Later, as Naomi was cleaning the floor-to-ceiling glass panels near the hallway, she heard a soft rustling sound. She turned and saw a young boy curled up beneath a table, staring intently at a painting on the wall, completely unaware of her presence. Naomi didn't say a word. She slowly stepped back, leaving space between them, like she was sending a silent message. I'm not here to make you do anything, but I'll be here if you need me. At that moment, Naomi didn't yet know the boy's name was Miles, and she had no idea he would become the reason her entire life would quietly shift direction, toward a kind of love that didn't need words, only the patience to stay. On the third morning of her shift at the Whitmore estate, Naomi brought her headphones and a short checklist. She had already learned how to move without a sound, avoid eye contact with the housekeeper, and, most importantly, never touch anything that looked remotely important. Miles was still just a shadow gliding through the empty hallways. Sometimes she spotted him sitting on the floor near the glass doors, spinning a bottle cap for hours. Other times, he disappeared entirely behind a closed door, leaving Naomi with a strange feeling, as if the boy lived in a world of his own, and that door was a border no one was allowed to cross. That morning, while Naomi was on her knees cleaning under the living room sofa, a sharp crash rang out, the sound of shattering glass, followed by a scream. Not a cry of pain. It was a scream that had no shape, raw, desperate, like a soul breaking open. Naomi ran toward the sound and found Miles curled up in the dining room. A glass of milk had spilled across the floor, shards of porcelain scattered everywhere. The boy had his hands clamped over his ears, eyes wide, his whole body trembling. His cheeks were flushed red, fingernails digging into his arms. No one else was around. The housekeeper had gone grocery shopping. Ethan was locked in his office, in the middle of a board meeting with London. Naomi froze for a moment. Logic told her to stay out of it, but her heart moved first. She slowly approached, saying nothing. She lowered herself to the ground a few feet away, keeping a safe distance. Then, just as she had done for years with her younger brother Jonah, she began to breathe, softly, evenly, with rhythm. She placed her hand on the floor, palm down, where Miles could see it, but didn't touch him. That was all. Just enough. Miles was still screaming, but minutes later the cries began to soften. He glanced at Naomi, a fleeting look, wild and unsure, like a small animal lost in the middle of a city. Naomi gave the faintest smile, careful not to startle him. And then, something impossible happened. Miles stretched out his hand, gently touched Naomi's. He didn't say a word, just touched, and left it there. Naomi's eyes welled with tears. Down the hall, cloaked in shadows, Ethan Whitmore had seen everything. He stood frozen, coffee cup suspended midair, all the times he had tried, all the experts he had flown in, and yet no one, not one, had ever gotten Miles to reach out on his own. And in that moment, Ethan didn't understand why exactly. But he knew, without a doubt. His heart had just moved for the first time in years. That evening, Ethan sat alone in his study, the glow of the laptop screen casting a pale light across his face, though his mind could no longer cling to numbers or charts. The strategic board meeting replayed softly in the background, but all he could hear was a voice, not from London, but a whisper, gentle as wind. Naomi's voice, calming Miles. He had watched the security footage 3 times, not to check if she had done something wrong, no, but because he still couldn't believe his eyes. Miles, his son who had been curled up inside his own silent shell for 3 years, had reached out to a stranger. Ethan had tried everything. Sensory toys, robotic pets, the best therapists money could buy. Yet never had he seen his son open up like that. "Who is she?" Ethan murmured to himself, as if Naomi were some kind of unsolvable equation. The next morning, he called the house manager into his office. "The new housekeeper?" "Naomi Carter. Does she have a file?" "Yes, sir. Sent by Help and Shine Agency. Partial college education, lives in Brooklyn. No criminal record." "Any experience with kids?" "Nothing noteworthy in the report. But she's quiet, does her job well, never complains." Ethan nodded. He opened his laptop and typed in the name Naomi Carter. Her profile was simple, almost nothing beyond a few hopeful quotes. But one photo made him stop. Naomi was hugging a young boy with a head full of wild curls and eyes that looked strikingly like Miles's. They stood in front of a red brick building, likely a treatment center. Below the image, the caption read, "The day my little brother learned to close his eyes while listening to music." Ethan felt something stir again inside his chest. He didn't know much about the world of special needs children. But Naomi, without a degree, without accolades, seemed to understand it intuitively with a kind of empathy that couldn't be taught in any textbook. Meanwhile, Naomi went about her work as usual. She never mentioned what happened the day before. She didn't act like she had crossed any milestone. But every time she cleaned near Miles's room, she left behind something small, like a soft fabric ball placed just so, or a chair nudged gently toward the window so the boy could look out at the garden. And then, one morning, Ethan stumbled across something that made him freeze in place. On a paper napkin next to Miles's breakfast tray, a small line of handwriting, neat and delicate, read, "Miles looked at me for 3 seconds this morning. He likes the morning light." No name, no signature. But Ethan knew it was Naomi. He folded the napkin gently, as if preserving something rare and fragile. At that moment, he wasn't thinking about love. He only knew that a stranger was teaching him how to be a father in the simplest way possible, by looking at his son with her heart. The following week passed like gentle ripples across a quiet lake. Nothing loud, no grand transformation, but to Ethan, every moment felt like a small miracle unfolding inside his own home. Naomi never made herself the center of anything. She was still just the cleaning girl, moving softly, carefully, mindful of every glass, every fold of every curtain. But something about the way she existed made the air around Miles feel lighter. The boy began sitting closer to the window, gazing into the garden a little longer, and even occasionally nodding when someone offered him food he liked. One early morning, Ethan walked into the kitchen and saw Naomi crouched beside Miles, gently holding a picture book. She wasn't reading aloud, just turning the pages slowly, her eyes flicking toward his after each image to catch a reaction. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, not wanting to disturb something so fragile, so priceless. "Miles, if you want the toast today, I'll put it in the box with the dinosaur, okay?" The boy didn't respond, but moments later, as Naomi stood and walked away, he quietly approached the green box on the table. Inside was a slice of peanut butter toast. Ethan could hardly believe what he was seeing. That evening, he finally summoned the courage to ask Naomi, something he had never asked anyone before. "What did you do? I mean, how is it that my son lets you get close?" Naomi looked at him, not with pride, but with a sincerity so deep it left nowhere to hide. "I didn't do anything special. I just stayed." Ethan fell silent. Naomi took a soft breath. Her voice gentled. "You don't have to understand, Miles. My little brother is the same way. These kids, they don't need fixing. They need someone who can sit through the silence without being uncomfortable." Ethan lowered his head, like someone reminded of a truth he'd long forgotten. That night, Naomi placed a soft, pale red ball near Miles's pillow, one lightly infused with sandalwood oil, the same scent Ethan used to wear when he held his son in those earlier days. She left a small note. "The scent of a father can help a child on the spectrum feel safe." Ethan followed her suggestion. And for the first time in over 2 years, when he walked into Miles's room the next morning, he found his son still asleep, clutching that ball. No flinching, no cold sweat, no strange murmurs like before. Just a child, sleeping peacefully, like any other child. Ethan stood by the bed for a long time, fingers gently tightening around the note. He didn't know when he began to trust Naomi, but now, with every step she took through his front door, a little more hope crept back into his heart, a heart he thought had died long ago. The autumn rain poured over the Whitmore estate that quiet Saturday night, turning everything beyond the windows into a blur, like an oil painting left out in the mist. Ethan was still up, sitting in his study, but his mind couldn't hold on to the reports in front of him. Instead, it kept drifting back to one image from earlier that day. Miles placing the first 3 pieces of a puzzle by himself, for the first time in 3 years. And Naomi had been right there beside him, waiting patiently through every moment. Ethan stepped out onto the balcony, hoping the night air would help him breathe more easily. But from the second floor, he caught sight of something that made him stop in his tracks. Naomi was sitting alone on the stone bench in the garden, though the rain had begun to fall. She didn't hold an umbrella, didn't look around. In her arms was a small, worn sweater. Not hers, but the one she always carried with her. The one that belonged to her little brother. She was crying. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just quiet tears running down her cheeks, like a stream that had been hiding underground for far too long and had finally found its way out. Ethan quietly went downstairs, grabbed a coat, and brought it out to her. He didn't say a word as he draped it over her shoulders. She flinched slightly, turning to look at him, but didn't hide the tears. "Sorry," Naomi whispered. "I didn't think anyone would see." Ethan sat down beside her without saying a word. The rain kept falling gently, as if it too wanted to make this conversation easier to begin. "My brother, Jonah, had a meltdown at the center today," Naomi said quietly. "The caregiver called me, but I couldn't leave work." She gave a faint, bitter smile, eyes still red. "I feel like a terrible sister." Ethan lowered his head. He knew that feeling, intimately. "I once walked out of a meeting with investors when Miles had a fever," he murmured. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but then the press called me unreliable, and the board just sat there in silence, like they agreed." They both fell quiet for a while. "What did you study?" Ethan asked gently. "Developmental psychology. I wanted to become a therapist for special needs kids." "Wanted to?" Naomi pressed her lips together. She looked down at her hands, calloused from cleaning chemicals and long hours scrubbing floors. "Wanting something doesn't matter much when you're broke." Ethan felt a sudden emptiness in his chest. He had always believed money could solve almost anything. But this young woman, with all her love, her patience, her understanding, had to give up her dreams simply because she couldn't afford rent. "You're not a terrible sister," Ethan said softly. "You're the only person who's made my son smile." Naomi turned toward him, her eyes filled with emotion, but also hesitation, doubt. And Ethan, for the first time in a long, long time, didn't see her as the cleaning woman. He saw her as a woman of quiet strength, someone fierce and resilient, and heartbreakingly alone. And he realized his gratitude wasn't just about what she'd done for Miles, it was about who she was. That night, under the soft rhythm of the rain, the two of them sat side by side without saying anything more. Some silences don't need to be filled. They just need someone to sit in them with you. In the days that followed, the Whitmore estate felt just a little warmer. Not because of the heating system, but because something between the three of them had begun to move in quiet harmony. Naomi still came in every morning, cleaned, cooked, and occasionally left small notes for Ethan about Miles. And Ethan, for the first time in years, was learning to shut his laptop at dinner time and actually sit beside his son. As for Miles, he seemed to be budding. No one expected him to suddenly become a normal child, but small milestones, like letting Ethan buckle his seatbelt or quietly listening to a short piece of music with Naomi, were miracles in themselves. But just as the heart began to learn hope, reality came sweeping in like a cold wind. It was Friday night. Ethan was reviewing his travel schedule when his longtime personal assistant, a woman in her 50s who'd been by his side for a decade, sent him a short email. "You need to see this. It's spreading fast." Attached was a link to an anonymous article posted on a blog notorious for gossip about the elite, with the sensational headline, "Widowed Billionaire and the Black Maid, Forbidden Romance or Social Climber's Scheme." The piece was filled with veiled accusations that Naomi was manipulating a grieving billionaire, using his autistic child as a gateway, and may have staged emotional moments to gain sympathy and control. There were even paparazzi-style photos of Naomi leaving the estate early in the morning, followed by speculative, ugly captions about unclear relationships. By the time Ethan finished reading, his chest felt hollow and cold. The next morning, Naomi noticed the shift, a strange glance from the housekeeper, a stiff nod from the gardener. No one said anything, but something toxic had crept into a house that once felt safe. And then Ethan came down from the second floor, holding his phone. His face no longer looked like the man who had draped a jacket over her shoulders in the rain. His voice was calm. Too calm. "Have you seen what's being said online?" Naomi nodded. She had known this moment would come eventually. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said softly, but with quiet conviction. "I just treated your son like a child who deserves to be loved." Ethan stayed silent for a long time. Maybe he believed her, But he also knew what could happen if the media kept fanning the flames. Naomi looked at him, no anger in her eyes, only a sorrow so deep it barely had a bottom. "I'll leave. Not because I'm afraid, but because Miles deserves a home quieter than whispers and safer than rumors." She turned and walked away without waiting for permission. Ethan didn't stop her. He simply stood at the window, watching the one person who had managed to reach not only his son's heart, but his own disappear without a sound. That afternoon, Miles cried harder than he ever had before. He banged his hands against the wall, pulled at his hair, curled into himself like a frightened animal. Ethan rushed in, trying to hold him, trying to soothe him, but Miles screamed just one word, again and again through his tears. "Naomi!" The house shook. Ethan collapsed to the floor, clutching his trembling son, his heart shattering inside his chest. He had let her go, and with her, the fragile trust his son had only just begun to build. The Whitmore house sank into a heavy, suffocating silence after Naomi left. No more soft footsteps on the wooden floors. No more faint scent of cinnamon wafting from the kitchen each morning. No more tiny handwritten notes beside Miles' breakfast tray. Only the ticking of a clock, the wind howling against the glass, and the rising panic of a little boy who didn't understand why the only person he'd ever opened up to had disappeared. Miles changed. Drastically. He curled up in corners, refused to eat, refused to engage. The tiny breakthroughs he'd made with Naomi, the first glance, the first gesture, the first reaction, seemed to vanish the moment she did. He slipped back into his wordless world. Only this time, it felt darker than ever. Ethan couldn't take it. He tried everything, rehiring specialists, reaching out to elite support schools, but nothing worked. His son screamed, clawed at himself, and whispered through broken sobs one single name: Naomi. One night, Ethan sat alone in his office, clutching a paper airplane, one Miles had folded and given to Naomi. He could no longer hide behind meetings or email threads. For the first time in his life, Ethan didn't feel like a failed father. He felt like a coward. He opened his laptop and typed a simple yet powerful statement on his personal social media. "No one has the right to question a person's worth based on their job or the color of their skin. Naomi Carter is the woman who brought my son's smile back. I am grateful to her, and I trust her with all my heart as a father." Within hours, the post went viral. Thousands of supportive comments poured in, alongside sharp criticism of classism and the quiet cruelty of prejudice. But Ethan didn't stop there. He walked straight into his company's communications office and demanded an exclusive interview. Not to promote a product, but to talk about Naomi, about Miles, and about the quiet women who saved his life without ever asking for credit. The next day, during a live-streamed interview, Ethan sat in front of the camera, his eyes no longer cold or guarded. He told everything, from Miles' silence to that first touch to the little notes Naomi used to leave behind. "I used to think love had to be grand," he said, "but Naomi taught me that love is sometimes just staying, quietly, patiently, without needing to be seen." He paused, then looked straight into the camera and spoke clearly. "Naomi, if you're watching this, please come back. Not for me, for Miles. He needs you, and this time I'll be the one who changes, not you." Then he stood and bowed his head. A rare gesture from a billionaire who once believed he'd never need to bow to anyone. Because now he knew, to truly love, you have to start with humility. Naomi watched the interview on an old screen in the tiny break room of the special care center where she now worked part-time. At first, she reached to turn it off the moment Ethan's face appeared. But his voice, deeper, slower, stripped of the commanding tone of a CEO, made her pause. Every word he spoke, every name he mentioned, every small memory of the notes she used to leave for Miles came rushing back like a tide she couldn't hold back. And when he bowed his head before millions, Naomi felt her heart tighten. Not because of the apology, but because, finally, Ethan understood. That afternoon, Naomi picked up Jonah, her younger brother, from his therapy session. On the way home, Jonah suddenly looked up and asked a question that caught her breath. "Naomi, are you sad because Miles doesn't smile anymore?" She turned toward him, stunned. Jonah rarely spoke about feelings, but this one landed right on target. "Yeah," she whispered. "I'm sad because I left when I should have stayed." Jonah didn't say anything else, but when they got home, he quietly dug through a box of old toys and pulled out a worn-out stuffed dinosaur. He placed it in her hand. "This is for Miles." Naomi wrapped her arms around her brother, unable to hold back the tears. The next morning, she took the earliest train back to Riverdale, carrying nothing but a small bag and the old stuffed dinosaur. No warning, no expectations. The Whitmore estate appeared beneath the soft morning light, quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. Naomi walked up, her heart a little unsteady. But before she could even press the bell, the door opened. Ethan stood there. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a simple gray sweater, and eyes that looked different now, softer, more human. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. No explanations were needed anymore. No questions. From inside the house came a small sound. Quick footsteps. Miles. The boy ran out on unsure feet, eyes wide, gaze locked onto Naomi. No hesitation, no avoidance. He rushed forward and threw his arms around her, burying his head into her chest like the world had just stitched itself whole again. Naomi held him, silently. One hand on his back, the other clutching the old, frayed dinosaur. Ethan stood quietly, eyes glistening. He didn't interrupt, didn't speak, just watched, like a man learning how to love all over again. That day, the three of them didn't talk about work, or the media storm, or the pain they'd been through. They simply sat together in the garden behind the house, the same place where Ethan had first seen Naomi from above. The small woman brave enough to step into a silent child's world and somehow bring back the light. And for the first time, in each of their hearts, the word home was no longer just a place. It was the people willing to stay. That winter came early. Snow fell gently, blanketing the backyard of the Whitmore estate. The same garden where Naomi and Miles spent their mornings sipping hot cocoa and playing cloud-shaped guessing games. The house no longer echoed with quiet footsteps or dry instructions. Now it carried laughter, soft music, the smell of baked cookies, and whimsical drawings by Miles, taped proudly along the hallway walls. Miles still didn't speak much. But every time he tugged at Naomi's sleeve to point at something, or gently placed a hand on Ethan's knee to sit close, both adults understood. He was loving in the only way he knew how. One evening, after Miles had fallen asleep, Ethan walked into the kitchen where Naomi was jotting down notes on the boy's daily habits. He hesitated, holding something small wrapped in a handkerchief. "I want to show you this," he said, placing it gently on the table. Naomi unwrapped it, and her heart caught in her chest. It was the paper airplane Miles had folded weeks ago. But now, scrawled across it in shaky pencil strokes, were the words, "Mommy, stay with me?" Naomi covered her mouth, tears welling instantly. "He wrote it himself," Ethan whispered. "No one taught him. It's the first sentence he's ever written on his own, and it was for you." Naomi couldn't speak. Only tears fell, soaking into the folds of old paper like tiny echoes of love. Ethan stepped closer, sitting beside her, his eyes serious, but no longer burdened like before. "Naomi, before you came into my life, I thought being a father just meant doing what's expected. But you taught me that fatherhood means starting over, with your heart." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. It wasn't flashy, not the kind of massive diamond the world might expect from a billionaire. Just a simple ring, with a single blue-green stone that shimmered, like the look in Naomi's eyes the first time she saw Miles. "I don't need you to become someone else. I don't need you to change. I just need you to stay." Naomi was still, her eyes glistening, but this time her lips curved into a soft smile. She didn't answer with words. She simply placed her hand over his and nodded, just enough for Ethan to know her heart was ready. Their wedding wasn't grand, just a quiet ceremony in the garden, with Miles and Jonah as ring bearers, the scent of cinnamon in the air, soft jazz playing, and a handwritten sign strung between two maple trees. Family is where we are understood, even without saying a word. Naomi and Ethan's story wasn't a fairy tale. It was a resurrection, from grief, from silence, from hearts once frozen. And sometimes miracles don't come from gods. They come from someone who chooses to sit beside you, quietly, patiently, and love you, exactly the way you need to be loved.